All right. Well, as I said, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see you on a Saturday. And this is the fifth session in our Building Beloved Community series for UU Justice Ohio, our webinar series for the spring. And today we are absolutely thrilled to have Molly Toth with us as a presenter on Grassroots Lobbying 101. And Molly is with the Unitarian Universalist Church of Youngstown, Ohio, and she's the advocacy coordinator for the YWCA. So welcome, Molly, and as you start your slides, you can do any more introduction that you might like, or say a few words right now if you'd like.
Sure. So first I want to thank you all for being with me this morning for our webinar. And I want to thank Reverend Joan for giving me the opportunity to work with you all. I met Reverend Joan back in January when she came to my home church, which, as she mentioned, is UUYO, the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Youngstown, back in January when we were getting ready for our first Ready for Justice meeting. And I told her about the kind of work that I do with the YWCA, and that I would love to use my experience in advocacy and grassroots lobbying to help UUJO. So I'm just really glad that we were able to get this together this morning. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and this training. Again, my name is Molly. I live in Youngstown. In my day job, I'm the Director of Advocacy for the YWCA Mahoning Valley. And I sometimes joke that my other day job is being a member of UUYO. I serve on the Board of Trustees. I'm involved in worship. I coordinate our young adult small group ministry, and I'm also involved in the Ready for Justice pilot program. This webinar is an adaptation of a training that I developed in early 2017 for my job at the YWCA. It was right after the 2016 presidential election, and I was watching people around me wake up to some pretty harsh realities. And people were angry, and people were scared, and they still are. So I saw people who I never knew to be even remotely political issuing calls to their friends to start calling their senators about confirmation hearings and signing petitions and holding rallies. And I was really inspired by all of the action happening around me, but I knew what was around the corner, which is burnout. I also noticed that people, even seasoned activists, were unfamiliar with some of the bureaucratic and labyrinth aspects of our government and needed help directing their advocacy to the right people at the right time.
Great.
So let me share
let me go through the other little bits on UUJO, and then we'll do a chalice slider, and I'll turn it over to you for your screen share.
Sure.
All righty. Just a couple little words about UU Justice Ohio. Of course, don't forget that we have a website, and we have a Facebook page and Twitter, and we have a YouTube channel, Unitarian Universalist Justice Ohio. So please check us out on those. And next session is going to be on Wednesday, May 2nd at 7 p.m. And that's going to be a big case study about the Akron UU congregation and how they have renewed their justice ministry in absolutely marvelous ways over the last few years. They even won the Bennett Award 2 years ago for their justice ministry from the UUA. And then, of course, to remind you that the Poor People's Campaign in Ohio, it's starting up on May 13th, right after Mother's Day, and then 40 days of action. A lot of it focused in Columbus here on the state capitol. If you haven't signed up yet to get the information, please do so. And for those of you in Pennsylvania, as you know, they're doing it in Pennsylvania as well. So please remember to sign up there. And then just to do a little chalice lighting, since we are a faith community, and our justice work is not just social justice work, but justice ministry. I want to start with just a little chalice lighting and a quote from Margaret Wheatley, who says, "There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about." And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and then I'm going to ask Molly to share hers.
All right. Give me 1 second. Okay. So, welcome to Amplify Your Voice. This is a crash course in grassroots lobbying, and we're going to do a little civics crash course. I wanted to mention that I used to work for a state representative, and I was used to working with citizens groups and lobbyists and everyday constituents. And I thought to myself around the time of the 2016 election that I've been on the other side of the desk and I know what legislators want to hear and I know what moves them. So maybe I can help other people get clued into that so we can all move the needle together. So I put together this training where I kind of poured out everything that I wish I had known when I was a young college activist, and then later when I was doing community organizing workshops and all the things that I kind of gathered as I was working in the State House as a staffer. And I also worked with a good friend who used to work for a sitting U.S. senator. So I called this training Amplify Your Voice, and I made some fancy graphics, and voila, I had a training. And throughout 2017, I trained about 300 people in Youngstown and Warren, and the training was nominated for a YWCA USA Excellence in Advocacy Award. So we're really proud of the training. I'm really glad that I was able to bring it with you, or bring it to you today. So I want to ground this training before we get into the agenda by telling you that this work is sacred and it's messy and it's oppositional and it can be tense, but it is sacred at the end of the day. Being a good steward of your neighbors and your fellow community members is a kind of holy work on its own, and staying informed is sacred, and calling in decision makers and demanding justice is holy and sacred too. So this is our agenda for the morning. We're going to do a little introduction to what is advocacy. We're going to do a little brief civics crash course, and then we're going to get into the meat of the discussion about how we can really affect change, how to direct our asks, how to craft compelling stories, and how we can stay in the know. So people whose leads we can follow when we are unsure of how to proceed. So, as I mentioned before, this training was developed shortly after the 2016 presidential election. And in the first few weeks that I was piloting this project, we were up against the Muslim ban, the reinstatement of the global gag rule, limiting NGOs from talking about birth control and abortion. We had the nominations of folks like Betsy DeVos and Scott Pruitt and Steve Mnuchin, and the list goes on. It was a really chaotic time. But I rolled out this training on the heels of the Women's March, which was the single largest nationwide protest to ever take place. And that groundswell of opposition and resistance is what makes this work so important and so powerful. There's never been a more important time to get engaged in making change happen right where you are. And we live in chaotic times where it can be really difficult to zero in on one or two issues and respond to them well. And it can seem like the need is really great and our resources and efforts can be so limited, but we are seeing results. So I just want to start off on a positive note by talking about some of the powerful examples that we've seen of people rising up to show that they care about issues that affect them. Just a few weeks ago, there were millions of people marching all over the country to highlight the problem of gun violence, and that was an effort led by teenagers. So you also have the opportunity to make your voice heard too, and to do some really incredible work. So I always start off this training with this quote from Frederick Douglass, where he says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." Advocacy is literally any action that you take to support a cause. Advocacy makes a demand of a person in power. It's asking for something and then having the people power to put pressure on those people who are in charge to make the change happen. Advocacy goes a little deeper than activism. An advocate is somebody who learns about issues and defines solutions, builds networks, bringing other people into the fold, and then shares stories with those who are in power. And it's focused on the idea that if you aren't at the table, you are on the menu. Social justice advocacy is centered on the people who are most impacted by a certain policy. So it's giving a platform to people who are directly affected by an issue, say healthcare reform, to speak truth to those who are in power and to share their story. When we practice this kind of advocacy, we are centering the needs of the people who are most affected, and that's really powerful. We're using, or in some cases, creating a platform to elevate their stories and amplify their voices. So, a good advocate sets out to answer a series of questions. The first is, what is the root of the problem? With things moving as fast as they are these days, we need to get to the root of the problem, not just a branch. We need to hit the root. That means doing some research to figure out the nuts and bolts of what we're dealing with. Is this a state issue or a federal issue or a local one? Are you looking at a bill, something that was already signed into law, or a judicial ruling? And where in the process is it on its way to becoming a law or becoming policy or becoming decided on? Second question is, who's got the power? It's important to know who has the power to make the change that we want to see. So that could be the person with the power to vote for or against a bill, or to sign or veto a bill, or influence the outcome in some way. You want to be directing your inquiries and your comments and your demands to the right people. And you also want to understand your power. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But it's important to remember that we are constituents and we can hold politicians accountable, and they want our vote. And if they want our vote, they have to work for it. So next, what is our demand? Remember what Frederick Douglass said, that power concedes nothing without a demand. Things will never change unless you demand that they be changed. When we decide to take action, we need to be very clear about what we want. When you are preparing to speak to a decision maker, you have a clear ask in mind, and you have to be unwavering in your demands. The next question is, how will we speak truth to power? This is where storytelling makes all the difference. A lot of us are inclined, myself included, to use data and statistics to argue our points, but research shows that it's those personal stories that persuade people. Data can help support, but it's the personal connection that really makes the difference. A compelling personal story can make even the least exciting thing, like tax reform, feel accessible and urgent and real. And then the final question is, how are you going to keep up the pressure? Always remember this: you are entitled to the time and attention of your legislators and their staff. They are there to serve you. It's their job. You can call them often, and you should. You can ask hard questions of them, and you should. My 3 Ps for this are to be polite, persistent, and personable. So who is an advocate? An advocate is somebody who does the work of showing up and going beyond rallies and protests. They're doing the deep work of getting to the root of a problem and seeking to understand it from different angles. So they offer up solutions, not just opposition. An advocate uses the power of story to transform and shape a narrative, to persuade those in power to be moral and just in their decision making. An advocate can really be anybody who stakes out their moral ground and seeks to win others to create change. So any good advocate has to know what they are talking about. So now we're going to take some time to walk through some concepts that might seem kind of elementary, because they are. You learned them in 3rd grade or 4th grade, but I promise they will be worthwhile. So I chose 4 big topics to cover in this kind of nuts and bolts section, because these are the areas that have the most obvious and immediate effects on vulnerable people's day-to-day lives. And they're also the areas that a lot of us, even seasoned activists and advocates, have a hard time keeping straight. So we're going to talk about the basic structure of our government, how to interact with it, and then move into talking about bills, executive orders, and then we'll end with budgets. I promise it'll be kind of fun, I hope. So we'll start with the basic structure of our government. The structure replicates itself at the federal level, to the state level, and then to the local level. All levels have a constitution. Some municipalities, like counties, cities, and townships and villages, have codes and charters which function kind of like a constitution. But at each level, policy gets made, it gets changed, it gets repealed, and it gets adapted when bills get passed into law, when an executive order from the president or the governor gets issued, and when the judiciary hands down precedent. In Ohio and in the federal government, voters also have the power to change law by amending their constitutions using ballot initiatives, but this is a very difficult and tricky process. And I know that there are a lot of groups in Ohio right now that are pushing certain issues like an end to gerrymandering, and I think there's a ballot initiative about prisons and banning the box, but it's hard work, it's a slog. So we'll start off by talking about the legislative branch. These are the folks who write bills, which eventually, if they are worthy, become laws. Locally, they're your city council. Statewide, it's your state representatives and your state senators. I want to note that although federally we call our senators and the House of Representatives Congress, in Ohio they are not called Congress. So don't call and say, I want to speak to my Ohio Congress when you're trying to reach like your state senator or your state rep. And federally, as I mentioned, it's your U.S. senators and your House of Representatives, your congressmen. You might hear that the House and Senate are sometimes referred to as chambers. We have a bicameral setup of our legislature. So there are two bodies in the federal and the state government that have to pass policy before it can advance to become law. And it's supposed to be a checks and balances process. It doesn't quite function like that because nothing in government functions the way that it was intended to. That's one thing that we'll learn as we walk through this process. So here, the most important part is that you will see how you can interact with your legislative branch. You can do things like personally oppose and support legislation. You can write and call and email your senators and reps. You can testify on legislation. You can schedule visits with them. You can attend their town hall meetings if they are actually hosting them. You can tweet at them. You can link to them on Facebook. You can post on their Facebook walls. And you can also seek assistance from them. So one of the vital services that they provide is constituent services. As a staffer in the Ohio House, I handled all kinds of issues for people, from working with the Medicaid office to process applications, to liaising to ODOT on a culvert construction issue, to liaising with federal legislative staff on immigration issues. They are there to serve you. So the executive branch, these are the people who enforce and carry out laws. Locally, it's your mayor. Statewide, it's your governor, lieutenant governor, and the people who head up state agencies like Jobs and Family Services or the Department of Transportation. Federally, the branch is headed by the president, sometimes referred to as POTUS, and then the vice president, sometimes referred to as the POTUS, and secretaries of various departments. So the executive office of the president, so people like the chief of staff and your press secretary, they're also considered part of the legislative branch. I wanted to note that county commissioners, Ohio does have a county government structure. Not all states have one like ours, but county commissioners kind of function in this weird gray area where they're both legislative and executive. And when you are interacting with the executive branch, you'll note that you have fewer opportunities to interact with them, but you can still do it. So you can oppose and support the passage of bills. You can oppose and support executive orders and appointments to courts or to cabinets or to departments. You can write and call and email them. You can interact with them on social media. And some groups use political pressure to force change by, working to get them out of office. And with the judicial branch, these are the people who interpret laws and settle disputes about laws and decide how laws should be applied across society. So locally, you have your magistrates, common pleas courts. I noted that there's a typo, please excuse that. Municipal courts. At the state level, you have your state SCOTUS, so Supreme Court of Ohio. That's also a typo, I apologize. Courts of appeals and district courts, and then federally you have the Supreme Court of the United States, also called SCOTUS. You have district courts, you have courts of appeals. And the opportunities for interacting with the judicial branch are somewhat limited. The judicial branch is kind of intended to be this kind of body that isn't easily swayed. So they're supposed to be impartial. We know that they aren't always. So the things that we do as citizens, as constituents, aren't really intended to impact the judicial world. So we can, as individuals or as organizations, comment on judicial rulings. We can bring lawsuits challenging decisions or actions by the government. So two great examples would be the Muslim ban that has been litigated and relitigated, I think, 4 times now, and then Obergefell v. Hodges, which was the Supreme Court case that eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court that gave us marriage equality. And as citizens, probably the primary way that we interact with the judicial branch is by serving on a jury. So you can see, having looked at those charts, that we really have the most opportunities to influence change when we're working with the legislative branch. And as advocates, our interests are often focused on the creation and support of good policy and the prevention of bad policy from passing. That's because this is the area where things are really fluid and they have the most malleability, so the greatest ability to change. So the best place I wanted to note to get started with all of this is to get familiar with the folks who represent you. On the Ohio Legislature website and on PAs and congress.gov, you can figure out who represents you. So in Ohio, you have a rep and a state senator. In Congress, you've got 2 senators. So in Ohio, it's Sherrod Brown and Rob Portman, and you also have a representative. Look them up, put their numbers in your phone, call them all the time, bug the heck out of them. That's what they're there for. Okay, so who remembers my friend Bill? This is Bill. He's just sitting on Capitol Hill. Yep, we're talking about how a bill becomes a law. At any given point, there could be hundreds of bills circulating in the Ohio legislature and thousands circulating in Congress. It is extremely difficult and even possible to keep up with all of them. Later on, we'll talk about how to get a handle on the massive volume of bills and other attention-worthy things that are going on politically every day. So the process of a bill becoming a law looks pretty similar at the state and federal level. So we'll focus on the state level because that's where UUJO is really focusing its efforts. And this is also an area where we as constituents have the biggest, most effective ability to make change. So a bill gets introduced. A legislator, if they are a good legislator, gets an idea from a constituent who says, hey, I see that this is a problem for me. I'd love you to introduce a bill to change it. A good legislator will say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And they'll draft legislation. Or a bill gets handed to them by a lobbyist. That's frequently how things happen anymore. So the bill gets drafted. They write the whole thing out. They seek co-sponsors, so people who will be sympathetic to the mission of the bill or what the bill is trying to do. And then it gets filed with the clerk's office. One thing that often happens in order to expedite the process is that a companion bill will get introduced. So if one bill focusing on, say, domestic worker pay gets introduced in the House, a senator might also introduce the exact same bill in the Senate. And the goal is that they'll move through the process roughly concurrently, and then there won't be too many differences to hash out at the end of the process. So if you hear about a bill being introduced and you want to support it or you want to oppose it, the best recourse is to contact your representative or your senator, depending on what chamber it was introduced in, and say, hey, I want you to support this, or hey, I'm really hoping that you don't. After it gets introduced, it gets referred to a committee, and committees function like issue-specific working groups. So generally, every bill that's in a committee will at least have one hearing where the sponsor of the bill comes in and says, hey, here's why I did this. If it's a bill that has a good chance of passing or there's political will to pass it, they will call opponent and proponent testimony. So you'll have interested citizens, you'll have lobbyists, you will have organizations like a UUJO type organization coming and giving testimony. And then the committee can vote it down, in which case it's dead and it's not going to go anywhere. Or the committee, if they see that it's worthy of being passed onto the floor, they will vote it out, and then it will eventually possibly make it to the House floor or the Senate floor for a full vote. So if a bill is sitting in committee, if your representative or your senator is sitting on that committee, you of course want to contact them. If they are not, then you want to contact the committee chair. The committee chair is always from the majority party. So in Ohio, we have a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. So it would be a Republican who you would reach out to. And the ranking minority member is always from the minority party. So in Ohio, that would be a Democrat. And that is set up to roughly keep some checks and balances. Generally speaking, though, the majority party really sets the agenda, and they really control what gets to committee, what gets to floor, what gets passed. So after a bill has made its way out of the committee, it gets sent to the floor. So the majority party, again, sets the agenda. The Speaker of the House, who is from the majority party, will call bills down to the floor. If it's the best way to get bills pushed through is to have it either be a Republican bill or have it be a bipartisan effort. Generally, and it swings both ways. The pendulum swings back and forth. But in Ohio right now, Democrats are not having as easy of a time getting bills called to the floor for debate. So once it's on the floor, it can be amended, they can vote it down, or they can vote it out of the chamber. And at that point, you really want to be contacting your own representative or your own senator. So it goes through this process. After it's left either the House or the Senate, it gets kicked over to the other chamber. It goes through the committee process. It gets a floor debate. And then if it passes both chambers and if there are differences in the bill, it goes into what's called concurrence. So the bill goes to a conference committee. They pick their best and brightest, and they hash out the differences. And at that point, it becomes an act. So it's intended for passage. At that point, you want to be contacting any member of what's called the conference committee. And those are typically listed on the Ohio legislature's website. So once it's gone through concurrence and it's deemed worthy of passage, it gets passed on. If it's a federal bill, it gets passed to the president, or in Ohio, it gets passed to the governor. So they can sign it, which means it gets passed into law, or they can veto it, which means it is not passed. Budgets are particularly interesting because the governor can go through and line item veto and strike certain things. He can't add things, but he can take things out. And when it's in this process, the person you want to be contacting is the head honcho, so the president or the governor. And typically, it takes 90 days before a bill, which is now law, goes into effect, unless it's scheduled as an emergency. And they use emergencies for all kinds of things. They're not usually actual emergencies. And if it's an emergency, it goes into effect immediately upon signing. So that's that process. And now I want to give you some tools for researching and reading bills. In Ohio, the best way to figure out what's moving through the legislature is to check in with the Legislative Service Committee. And they are an independent, nonpartisan body responsible for maintaining an accurate, and I said mostly up-to-date collection of bills and acts. Sometimes they're a few days behind. So they also, as a service, provide research and analysis to members, and they'll do independent research on bills as they are moving through the process. And on their website, which is legislature.ohio.gov, you can search for bills, you can view committee hearings to find out when things got heard, read any testimony. If it's been voted on, you can view votes. Federally, the Library of Congress maintains the congressional record and its online presence at congress.gov. And there you can search for bills, you can view committee hearings, read testimony, view votes. One thing that the federal government has that we do not have in full in Ohio is the ability to read the transcripts of hearings or watch debate from committees and from the House and Senate floor. We're supposed to in Ohio have film and video available from all committee hearings, but they have not implemented that yet. So it's a slow process, and hopefully we will get that ability soon. But you can still read testimony and view votes and do all of that. So I'm going to take you through a little tour of the Ohio Legislature's website and just show you how to find a bill. So this is the main page of Senate Bill 14, and I just kind of picked this one at random. On the summary page, you will get the basic info. So what number is it? Who sponsored it? What topics roughly does it address? And you'll see this one falls under a ton of different subjects. And then you can see what committee is hearing it. So you'll want to, if it's a pretty comprehensive bill, usually under documents, you will find some analysis that's been drafted by the Legislative Service Commission or the LSC, including any fiscal notes if it's expected to have an impact on the budget. For larger, complicated bills, LSC will draft analyses that break down what each part of the bill would do. Under status, which is where we are right now, you can see where the bill is sitting. So you'll note that when it got introduced, it was January of 2017. It's been sitting in the Transportation, Commerce, and Workforce Committee. It got referred there on February 1st, 2017. So we can guess based on who introduced it, the primary sponsor, Charlita Traveris, I think she is from Cleveland, and the fact that it has been sitting in committee for over a year and has not had any hearings, that it's probably not going to go anywhere. So sometimes they get introduced and they just sit there indefinitely until the end of the General Assembly. That's another thing that's important to note. Bills don't carry over from General Assembly to General Assembly. They can get reintroduced, but after the Assembly ends, they are dead and gone. And under the votes tab, if this had been a bill that had been voted on, you would be able to see how the committee votes went down, if it did indeed get voted on, and if it had made it to the floor, how the votes happened that way too. So if you are like me, you are not a legal scholar and you have no designs on becoming one in your spare time, and you also probably don't know Ohio Revised Code. I don't know many people who do. So that's why it can be helpful to learn to read between the lines on the first page of a bill. So bills that have primary sponsors from both parties have a better chance of passing, as I mentioned before. The more co-sponsors they have listed, the higher chance it has of passing, because that means that all of these people have already essentially endorsed it and said, yes, when it comes time to vote, I will vote yes. Bill summaries are a very helpful way of getting the gist of what a bill can do if you aren't inclined to read through the following pages of mumbo jumbo, which probably won't make much sense to people like you and me. And honestly, unfortunately, we are so polarized politically that very often just looking at the sponsors of a bill on especially hot button topics like abortion or immigration or gun control can give you a really good idea of what it's all about politically. So I'll leave this up for a second. We want to make sure that we are always in the correct General Assembly. We right now are in the 132nd General Assembly. After January, we'll switch over and be 133. The worst thing that you could do is call your legislator about a bill that is from 2 or 3 General Assemblies ago, because they're going to say, I don't even remember that, and it's not going to be relevant, and it's going to be a waste of your time. And also you want to note the Senate bill number, the House bill number. They're numbered sequentially, and they go in the order in which they get filed with the clerk's office. So another way that policy gets made is through the issue of executive orders by the president or by the governor. The president tends to use them much more frequently than the governor does. We've been hearing a lot about executive orders, especially in the first few months of the new presidential administration. Our current president at this point in time, I think, has signed about 60 executive orders. So that's a decently high number. Executive orders are really interesting because there's really no direct statement in the Constitution that explains what they are or what they can do. But every president, with the exception of William Henry Harrison, who died a month into taking office, has issued at least a couple of them. So where do they come from? Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution vests executive powers in the president and makes him the commander-in-chief, and requires that the president, quote, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. So that's kind of vague. We don't really know what it means. Legal scholars go back and forth about it. Often, presidents will issue executive orders when they don't have a ton of political power. A great example is how President Obama issued executive orders on a lot of touchy subjects like LGBT rights, which at the time were not massively favored by the public. And he also was working with Republican-dominated House and Senate. So in 2014, he used the power of the executive order to protect LGBT workers who contracted with the federal government. At the time, again, both chambers of Congress were Republican controlled, so it's really unlikely that a bill with those same provisions could have been passed. Another, probably the most famous user of the executive order was FDR. FDR used the executive order both for great good and for what turned out to be some great evil. He established internment camps during World War II using Executive Order 9066, but he also used an executive order to create the Works Progress Administration, which helped bring the country out of the Great Depression. So you can see that the executive order can be a really expedient way to accomplish something that could be politically unsavory or kind of controversial. So executive orders are subject to judicial review. If they don't pass constitutional muster or they lack support by some statute, they can be overturned by a judicial body. Major policy initiatives do require approval by Congress, But executive orders have a lot of influence over the internal affairs of government, deciding how and to what degree legislation will be enforced, dealing with emergencies, waging wars, and in general, fine-tuning policy choices in the implementation of these very broad statutes. So while an executive order can have the same effect as a federal law under certain circumstances, Congress can pass a new law to override an executive order, but that new law is also subject to presidential veto. So you can see how there's a loop there. So one sure way of getting rid of an executive order is changing the person who's in the White House. And if an administration doesn't like an order from a previous president, it can legally reverse it on its own. We have seen that happen several times with the new administration. If an executive order is signed by the president and the public finds it unreasonable, we unfortunately have pretty limited recourse. The best bet is really through the court system. So a recent example is a number of courts taking up the president's executive order on immigration, aka the Muslim ban. Organizations like the ACLU play an important role in litigating a lot of these executive order issues that come up. Congress can also pass a law to override the executive order. And if that comes up, constituents can throw their support behind the measure, contacting their member of Congress and encouraging them to do the same. So the last big thing that we will talk about before we get into the fun stuff is budgeting. Everybody has to have a budget, including our government. It's helpful by starting off with budgets as visionary documents. Elected officials use budgets to lay out their vision for the state or for their country. So when a governor or president issues a budget proposal, they are really going big. They deliberately issue budgets that are, for example, either really heavy on spending for social programs or really austere budgets that cut things. It's their way of either saying, like, look how liberal and compassionate I am, or conversely, look at how conservative and fiscally responsible I am. The budget that gets proposed is not the same budget that we end up with at the end of a very lengthy and involved budgeting process. For us as UUs, we want to think about budgets as moral documents. What we are funding or not funding says a lot about what we value. So here in Ohio, we have a unique situation because we have a governor who talks a big moral game and likes to tell people that he expanded Medicaid because it's the moral and just thing to do. But we also see in his budgets that they maybe lack some of that moral clarity or that moral compunction. Not when they are cutting funding for low-income housing and reallocating funds away from predominantly Black and brown communities to white ones, or when they include assaults on reproductive rights. The budget process in Ohio is intense and it moves quickly. There are a lot of opportunities for us as advocates to intervene if we pay close attention. Perhaps the most effective way is to give testimony, either written or in person. In person's always better, but I don't know how many of us can jump in a car and fly down to Columbus in 15 minutes notice. If you are interested in giving testimony on budgets, you should contact your rep or senator. Depending on where the budget bill is in the process, you can request an opportunity to speak before the committee that's hearing a particular part of a budget bill. But making lots of calls is also very effective. And so is writing a letter to the editor or hosting a media event to highlight some of the good things or bad things about a budget. I also wanted to note that budgets anymore are not just doing things like funding essential programs. They are made to make ideological statements. So we've had budgets passed through the Ohio House that include provisions like defunding Planned Parenthood. And they're supposed to be, the budgeting process, at least in Ohio, is supposed to be a very hands-on and publicly accessible process, but it's become less and less transparent and less easy for the public to follow. Last year during the budgeting process, they gave 5 minutes for testimony, and they had timers and they were cutting people off and they weren't filming and broadcasting the hearings. So it's something that we as advocates need to pay close attention to and really keep our finger on the pulse there. So we're going to start small with Ohio's budgeting process. I promise this won't take too long. So the bill always gets introduced in the House. And at that point, you want to be contacting your representative about your concerns. They generally are very good, the LSC is, about posting budget documents almost in real time. It takes them like a few hours to upload everything, but they are very good about posting that. It then gets referred to a committee, and you want to be contacting the chair or the ranking member of that subcommittee. So just like a regular bill, it kind of gets referred to, they'll take chunks of it. So if there's a chunk that deals with transportation and ODOT, it'll go to the transportation committee. If there's a chunk that deals with education, it'll go to the education committee. And if your representative or your rep is not sitting on those committees, then you want to be contacting the chair or the ranking member of those subcommittees. And then the chaotic, crazy part happens when they have their subcommittee hearings. When I was working in the House, this was the busiest time of my life. And I was in the office for like 15 hours a day because they start at 8 o'clock in the morning and they will go until 3 o'clock in the morning to get through everyone. And this is where all of the organizations and interested citizens come in and they testify either for or against certain aspects of the bill. And they really make the case for, hey, you should fund X organization, or we shouldn't be doing this. Then everything kind of gets rolled into one big bundle. So they bundle everything into what's called an omnibus. And at that point, you want to be contacting your representative directly. You want to contact the chair or the ranking member of the Budget Appropriations Committee. And then it moves into the House where it gets voted on. This is also a really hectic day for any poor, sad legislative staffer. These conversations, these floor debates can go on for hours, days, weeks. They really hash everything out. But once it has passed the House, the same process repeats in the Senate. And at that point, you want to shift your focus to contacting your senator or the chair or ranking member of the Senate subcommittees. The Senate then votes on it. It always has to go into conference committee because what the House and Senate come up with are never the same. The conference committee process is small. It usually involves, I think, 5 or 6 different people, and they sit in a room for days on end and they hash out every little detail. And then once they've come up with the best version of the bill, it moves on to the governor's desk. And we in Ohio, by law, are mandated to have a budget in place by July 1. Our fiscal year starts on July 1. And the governor has to sign the bill by 11:59 on June 30th, every odd year. So that's the state budgeting process. As you can see, pretty chaotic, pretty intense, moves quickly, but there are lots of opportunities for us as advocates to make our voices heard. So federally, the budgeting process is, as expected, much more complicated. This little flow chart really does not do it justice. And I want to note that the kind of like kick the can down the road, piecemeal way that we've been doing our budget for the last several years is really not the norm. It's not normal for our Congress, which does have the power of the purse, to fail to agree to fund critical programs. It's not normal for us to experience periodic government shutdowns the way that we have been. It's happened before, but this level of lack of cooperation and an inability to get our elected officials to come to the table is really pretty unprecedented. And I want to note that this is an area where our voices as UUs can be heard. So we can be both a voice for reason and justice in the process, and also kind of peacemakers. So we can be the people who are saying, well, we might not agree on this, but here's where we can find some common ground, and kind of call people into account and demand better and more moral policies. So federally, we do things a little silly. Our fiscal year begins on October 1st. The process starts in February of each year when the president works with the Office of Budget and Management to issue a budget request. And again, this is a vision document. And in the president's budget, he will come up with a lot of great ideas, like turning SNAP into a Blue Apron food delivery service, for example. At this point, you can start developing talking points. You can call your senators and reps and put them on notice. And then in February through April, we move into hearings and resolutions in the House and Senate. So the bill kind of moves through both chambers concurrently, and they come up with, I call them counter offers. So the House will say, well, we'll fund this at this level, and the Senate will say, no, we'll fund it at this, and then they hash out the differences. So at this point, when things are moving through these House and Senate budget committees, and they're individually writing and then voting on their own budget resolutions, you can contact your senators and your rep or the chair ranking member of these various budget committees. And then in mid-April, the House and Senate appropriations subcommittees go through the budget resolutions that were developed in the last step, and they mark them up and actually assign dollar amounts to programs. Then they'll vote as a committee, and it gets passed on to the House or the Senate. So in May through September, there's kind of a wide-ranging time frame there. The House and Senate debate, and they vote on the appropriations bills from the subcommittees. The bills that pass each chamber have to match up. So a conference committee will form, and they'll hash out the differences. And the House and Senate both vote on the new identical bills. Then the president signs them, making the budget law. Now, when Congress is slightly more functional than it is today, we don't have so many continuing resolutions to pass and anticipated shutdowns and all of that. But again, we are at a point where our elected officials can't find common ground and sometimes can't even find their way to the table to negotiate. So voices like ours are really needed in this process to not only be fierce advocates for people who are vulnerable, but to also bring our leaders together. And it's sad that we are there, but that's what we're working with. Okay, so now that we've gone through these nuts and bolts, I want to tell you a story. It's a personal one for me. In the summer of 2015, I was on a camping trip down in Mohican State Park. So I had no cell service, so I was getting no texts, no news. It was great. When my friend and I left the camp to go get provisions, I felt my phone start to buzz and buzz and buzz. I had dozens of missed calls and texts from my parents, so I immediately called them, and I learned that it was my brother. At 22, he had suffered an aortic aneurysm. Fortunately, my parents recognized right away that something was wrong, and they got into the hospital. The lights were all green. The best heart surgeon in Northeast Ohio had just scrubbed in. No one else was in the emergency room waiting. So all of these factors lined up to get my brother onto an operating table in less than 20 minutes. By the time I made the drive back to Youngstown, he was in critical condition. He had tubes snaking in and out of his body. He was bruised. He was swollen. He was barely recognizable, but he was going to be okay. So I cried, tears of relief, knowing that he was safe. And then with a little bit of distance, I started to cry for a different reason, because my brother was uninsured. He was a college student. And my thoughts immediately turned to, how is my family going to pay for this? I want you to imagine being in that moment when the worst possible thing has happened to somebody in your family, and all you can think about is, how much is this going to cost? That's the reality of the American healthcare system. Thankfully, my brother was retroactively able to enroll in Medicaid. His hospital bills were almost $1 million for his 20-day stay. That would have ruined my family financially and destroyed his future. We have the Medicaid expansion to thank for my brother's physical well-being and his financial peace of mind. So how did that sound? It sounded a lot more convincing than just rushing through, I want Governor Kasich to preserve Medicaid expansion. Okay, thanks, bye. That's the power of storytelling. When it's combined with thoughtful approaches to problems and a clearly and appropriately directed demand, it can make a big difference. When things are coming at us left and right and we don't know how to address them, it behooves us to stop, to do a little digging into the facts, then formulate our own personal response to it. Our power lies in our ability to both be on the right side of history as it's being made and to be smart and strategic about how we approach these problems. As advocates, we are always doing the work and then some. We get the facts straight, we formulate demands, and then we tell compelling stories to put a human face on problems that often get reduced to just numbers and statistics. So things are moving at a pretty rapid clip these days. The urge might be to kind of shout from the rooftops, but it's really important for us to zero in on a few things, those questions that we opened up with. So what is the root of the problem? Who's got the power? What is our demand? How will we speak truth to power? And how will we keep up the pressure? So first, we want to figure out the issue. Is it happening at the state level? Is it happening at the federal level? Was it a bill that was just introduced, or an order issued by the governor or the president or the head of a state or federal agency? That will guide who you talk to and how you proceed. The last thing you want to do is contact your state senator about something that your United States representative is doing. So interpreting bills, judicial rulings, and executive orders can be really tricky. You can turn to sources, though, that will help you identify what's good or bad in a specific bill or a judicial ruling or an executive order. I find that following a handful of trustworthy advocacy organizations helps me keep tabs on issues that I care about, and it also gives me tools for figuring out how to address issues as they arise. At the end of the webinar, I'll put up a slide that has some of the organizations that I follow that work on things like economic empowerment and poverty, racial justice, healthcare, so you can get a feel for what's out there. So I want to stress that it's important for you to do your research. Figure out who's got the power, who's going to give you the result that you want. So if you are calling your senator, for example, about a bill that funds domestic violence programs, it helps to know how they voted on things like that in the past. It also helps to know a little bit about that senator. Who is funding them? What is their family like? Do they go to church or temple? What is the common ground that you can share? And where can you meet them in the middle? And what is the personal story that you can bring out that will put a human face on the issue? So once you've figured out an angle, it's time to get in touch. So I want to stress that all communication matters. No communication is value-free, but some of it has more impact than others. I have like a little hierarchy of communication. So ideally, you want to have a sit-down visit, a face-to-face meeting with a decision maker. These are obviously the most impactful, but not the most practical. Their schedules are hectic. Your schedule is hectic. If it's your U.S. senator, they might not be back in the district for months at a time. So phone calls then are an awesome way to connect. You are able to speak, unless you catch a voicemail, to a real live human being, and you can take up their time, and you can tell a story, and you can make a demand. You can also send a personalized email or even a handwritten snail mail note. Some people still do that, and that is very powerful and effective. There's something about holding a piece of paper in your hand that you know someone took the time to write out that can really, as a former legislative staffer, I knew that that person cared enough to sit down and write it. So less impactful is a form email. So if you sign an online petition, these are great, but if you can add in your own personal story or your own ask, that will kind of give it the next little bump up. And then the least impactful is doing absolutely nothing. And I know that none of us are doing nothing. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The government is actually run by 23-year-olds. It is run by 23-year-olds who want to do their jobs well, and they want to move up, and they want to please their bosses by providing excellent constituent service. And it's run by 23-year-olds who are not yet so hardened by the world that they don't respond to a personal story. So when you call your legislator's office, you will almost certainly get a staff member on the line, and that's a really good thing. Everybody calls and they say, well, I want to talk to Rep so-and-so. You actually don't. Staffers have their finger on the pulse, and they can give you more time, and at the end of the day, they are the ones who have the most direct contact with constituents. So they can really be the ones who move the needle if they're getting swamped with calls about a bill. When I was a staffer, we were, as a state, moving through the process of debating a renewable energy bill. And I remember there was one day we were super busy, the House was in session, and I had 50 voicemails when I walked in at 8:30 in the morning, and my phone rang nonstop all day. So I texted my boss and I said, hey, I'm getting all of these calls. You have to do something about this. And she did. So staffers are kind of like your gatekeepers, and they are a really great resource. You can ask them for information about bills. You can ask them to reach out to other entities to provide clarification about specific provisions in a bill. They can help you with quite a bit. And I think that the one thing I want to get across is use them, use their time. They are there for you. So when you actually do call and you are wanting to advocate for or against a specific bill, it can get a little tricky. It can be a little nerve-wracking. I always make notes ahead of time. I write out a script that says, "Hi, my name is Molly Toth. I live at blah, blah, blah," because I know that if I get on the phone, I will get tripped up. So it's helpful to have it all written out ahead of time. So you want to make sure that you are including your name, your address, your ask, and your gratitude. You also want to make sure that you have a bill number if there is one. You can share a quick personal story. If you're on voicemail, you want to keep it brief. But if you have the staffer's ear, you can jabber on for a couple minutes. But you want to, at the end, make your demand very clear. So I want Senator so-and-so to vote no on HB 123. You want to always end with your demand. And again, the 3 Ps: be precise, be polite, be persistent, and then keep up the pressure. You can follow up with an email. You can make another phone call the following day. But more importantly, you can be inspiring other people to do the same. So you can blast this out to your networks. If you can't find an advocacy group that is already working on a particular bill that you're concerned about, but you know that it's important, you yourself can draw up a call script. And you can give people the phone number to call their rep, and you can post it on Facebook, or you can put it on Instagram. If you have people who are not connected to social media, you can email it. It can really be that simple. But what matters is that we have this sustained action and that we're really bringing other people into the fold. So what will tip the scales is having a critical mass of people. So it's important to know that you can and should be developing relationships with your elected officials. You can call them regularly. You can seek out their opinions on legislation. You can pitch ideas for legislation to them. You can arrange face-to-face meetups. Some are more open to that than others. Usually you have to have a pretty good reason, but if you can come up with a good reason, it is really good to get to know them. Also, you can keep tabs on them and find out when they're hosting a town hall meeting, because you can show up and you can ask a question there, or you can just introduce yourself and say, "Hey, I'm the person who's been calling your office every day." So I want to stress that the need for coalition building and for people working together is more apparent now than it has been in a long time. We're seeing massive amounts of executive orders on issues of pretty big importance coming down, lots of legislation moving, and unfortunately it is going to be the fact that we'll be operating in a largely reactionary capacity for a long time, I think, and it'll be a while before we can really be proactive. Right now, a lot of organizations are simply focused on maintaining and not losing funding, supporting the most vulnerable people who are finding themselves, pushed out of HUD housing or on deportation lists. So we are really doing some heavy lifting here just to maintain the status quo. That being said, it's important to remember that advocacy means doing this like long haul, unglamorous work of staying informed, informing other people, making the calls, writing the letters, showing up. It's fun and it's energizing and it's really good to show up to a protest. But deepening your engagement is going to be key to protecting some of the things that we are seeing that are now under attack today. As we move into the last section, I want to take a moment to say something about wins and losses. Some of you are already engaged in your own advocacy work, or you are networked in with other people. You've been calling your senators, you've been writing letters, wrangling other people to do the same, and it can feel like it is not working, and I know that feeling. As an example, when there was a certain Senate confirmation hearing for a cabinet head, last year, I probably made 50 calls in the span of 2 weeks just concerning this one nominee. and they ended up getting confirmed. In doing advocacy work, it's really important to remember to take your wins where you can get them. You have to put things in perspective. Our society does not place the same value on political engagement that other countries do. In Poland, about a year and a half ago, hundreds of thousands of women went on strike and took to the streets after Parliament enacted an abortion ban. And we just don't do that here in our country. We are not very politically engaged. We do not naturally have relationships with our elected officials, and politics is kind of a thing that happens out there. And we, by and large, don't pay attention to it. So the mere fact that we are getting people engaged is a really huge thing, and we should be proud of that. And we are moving the needle in some small ways, and we should celebrate it. In a society that really privileges like a detachment from politics, the fact that there are millions of people marching and calling and showing up is really something to be excited about. It's often said that advocacy is a marathon and not a sprint. I hope that if you walk away today with anything other than the basic knowledge of how you can take action, you walk away knowing that it's important to take a break sometimes. Things are very overwhelming right now, and if you're like me, you go to bed at night and your head is spinning because so much has happened in one day. But I want to stress that you deserve rest and respite. You can turn off your phone and you can go for a walk or take a little cat nap, and it doesn't make you a bad person, and all of this work is going to be there when you give back. To do this work of caring so deeply for the world, you have to also be caring for yourself. So I want to thank you for being engaged in this work, which is often very thankless and exhausting and very, very, very hard. And I mean it when I say that this work is sacred and it's so, so important. I always close my training with this note from the Talmud. Don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, and walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So those are just some closing thoughts. All of these handouts are available on YWCAofwarren.org. If you go under the What We Do and Advocacy tabs, you'll find them for download. And I also wanted to make sure that I leave you with some organizations that you can follow, including UUJO, who frequently issue commentary on bills or provide action steps for people to take, and even are just issuing those little like red alerts when something's moving down the pike. At this point in time, I am happy to take any questions that you might have. I think maybe I wrapped a little early, but I'm happy to move into conversation.
Molly, I'd just like to thank you for an excellent presentation. This is one of the most valuable hours I've spent.
Oh, thank you.
My policy of never listening to anybody under 70.
Well, I am very happy that you were able to join us, and I'm glad that it was useful. I have a particular passion for doing this kind of stuff, and it's actually very gratifying to have it all displayed in one place.
Molly, thank you. This is Karen in Cleveland. A wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you, Karen.
Can't wait to see the actual notes. I would have been writing nonstop had it not been made available. Thank you.
Yeah, the notes are online, and I can also arrange with Reverend Joan to get the slides sent out if you'd like the slides too.
Yes, please.
Okay.
And we are recording this so that we will, like I said, be uploading it to our YouTube channel, God willing, and put the link on the Facebook page.
Great.
This is Lori from Canton UU, and thrilled that we're partnering on some of these bigger initiatives.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I think the Poor People's Campaign especially is a really great opportunity for some coalition building, and it's given us the opportunity to work on things at a state level, but also stay connected to some of these larger federal and even global issues. So I agree.
Other questions? Questions, comments?
I have a quick, very quick comment, point of information.
Mhm.
If you do know a prior session's bill number, it could be a good reference for when you're calling to try to get a grip on what may be coming up. I used to do this. I used to advocate around foreclosure legislation, and we would refer to the last two versions of the bill when we were talking about the next coming up type thing. Otherwise, yeah, I just wanted to point that out. It can be useful to know what was, but that's basically when you call the person on the phone at their office.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you know that you are partnering with a legislator, or that they are considering, if you hear from a little bird, that they are considering reintroducing it, is really helpful to have that prior information. All of that stuff is available. The Ohio Legislative Service Commission makes all of that available in their archives. So I think they have it going back like 2 decades or something like that.
Great.
Molly, you were ranking different ways to contact your legislator, and you left out my favorite one, which is
What's that?
postcards.
Oh, yeah.
I like
yeah.
postcards because letters, particularly if you're sending them to Congress, they're going to get held to be inspected because they might have anthrax in them or something.
That's a good
Postcards don't
point.
have that weight, and people are less intimidated by being asked to write a postcard. They're more willing to do it than a letter.
That's true. That's
I'm a big,
really good to note.
so are they equivalent to a letter when you look at it or not?
So some insider info. I know that letters that get sent to the Ohio House and Senate get opened by staffers. So the turnaround time is pretty quick. We don't hold things in the Ohio House and Senate. So if you're sending to an Ohio representative, I would say a letter is fine, postcard's fine. Letter is my preferred format only because you can go a little deeper. But if you are sending to like your sitting U.S. senator or your representative, if expediency is a concern, then I would say for sure postcards. Just write tiny.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Long ago and far away, when I was interviewing some legislators in Colorado, where I lived there, one of them was really impressed with phone calls and unimpressed with postcards or petitions or letters. He said, for every phone call I get, I know that there are at least 50 people out there that agree with them. And so they were counting the phone calls.
Yeah, a good legislator will do that. I think the phone call is powerful because people generally don't like to do it, especially younger people. I know that I kind of am phone averse and would much rather email or text than talk on the phone. But yeah, I every day would keep a list of, abortion bill, environmental regulations bill, and hash mark and make special notes about every bill that people called about.
Any other comments or questions, my friends? Any final comments, Molly, then, as we wrap up?
Just that keep doing what you're doing. You are all, just by virtue of spending an hour and 10 minutes on your Saturday morning doing this webinar with me, that's an incredible testament to the fact that you're already engaged in this work and that you are looking to deepen your understanding. So just keep up. I think we're at a point where people are starting to get very tired, myself included, and it feels like we are not making a difference. But the more we dig in and the more we partner and the more we collaborate, the bigger the impact that we'll have. And I guess I just want to close by saying stay engaged, but also leave time for nice long walks and naps and all of the things that make you feel good.
Thank you so much. I think that message of persistence and patience, perseverance is absolutely wonderful to, listen to during this period of time. And I thank you all, and I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.